Alex. Everybody, this is Dr. Alex Pedersen. Alex is a professor at Queen's partly in the Geological Sciences, Geological Engineering Department, where she teaches in the MERL program, which is the Masters of Energy and something leadership. I don't even know what it stands for. Alex can tell you.
Right on.
And Alex also works at the Arthur B. McDonald Astroparticle Research Institute. So I'll leave over to you, Alex.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for that introduction. I will clarify some of the places that I work and teach for everyone's benefit. It's a real pleasure to be invited into your class. Matt is a good colleague and a friend of mine in the Geological Sciences and Geological Engineering Department here at Queen's University. But I recognize I'm going to be talking to folks that are Queens and beyond today. So thank you with an open heart to my colleagues here online who are interested in a slightly different, probably guest lecture than maybe what you've been getting already in this course, right? So I'm a human geographer, as I was sharing with John as I joined. I am a social scientist by training. I do qualitative ethnographic research on the ground with communities in the field. And I'm really excited today that I'll get to talk to you a little bit about that work. But I've been invited here today to talk a little bit about social sustainability as it relates to critical minerals. And I've brought my research to the table a little bit around the work that I do with Indigenous Maya and Xinca peoples in Guatemala. And so I anticipate that today is a very different kind of lecture or conversation than maybe what you've had in the rest of the course. And so I invite questions, considerations, your worldviews and perspectives to come to the table, because I bet we might be a little bit different in how we view things or how we've experienced things in the world based on our location as well as our training. Is anyone else a social scientist and a human geographer on the call, or are we mostly like technical experts, geologists, earth scientists?
We're mostly graduate students who are getting their first course in mineral deposits.
There you go.
But we've talked extensively how the effort to get resources has to involve much more than just your traditional geology departments. But Luke's got his hand up.
Luke, hey, how are you?
Yes, I am currently in the I currently work in GIS to help support school. So I'm transitioning to geophysics, but GIS is my current trade.
That's fantastic. So we have an overlap then. A lot of physical geographers use GIS. And so I know there's quite a bit from our extended field that would overlap with yours. So welcome. Again, thank you for the invitation, Matt, and the warm welcome from the class. Let's call this guest lecture today, Critical Mineral, Social Sustainability, and Indigenous Resistance, Lessons from Guatemala. So this is work that is built off of about 15 years of solidarity accompaniment. I've been working in the region since 2010 when I started my master's at the University of Northern British Columbia, again in international development studies, and then later moved on to my PhD in human geography here at Queen's University. So I am a Canadian. I come from a Canadian perspective, a critical perspective on how we talk in Canada about the mining industry. And my role quite often has been to lay a critical perspective of that nationalist narrative. And so I start off all of my presentations with this image of Irma Yolanda Chuk. This is a part of my land acknowledgement, something I know that's very common in Canada, but maybe not common in other places, where we start off a lecture in acknowledgement of Indigenous lands and territories. And I wanted to bring this image in particular to the forefront of our conversation, both because I'll give examples from Irma Yolanda's community, but also to remind ourselves that quite often, more often than not, I would say, mining happens on Indigenous lands. And I would say more recently, in the last few decades, we've come to recognize and understand who's involved as rights holders in the whole life cycle process of extraction. And Irma Yolanda represents a very negative case of how mining has gone off the rails for this community. And I did want to set a preface here with with folks in this classroom today of like, even though I'm looking at a negative case study, that doesn't mean that I am here to promote a no mining or an anti-mining vision. My hope here in these kinds of lectures and these spaces with good folks like yourselves is that you recognize the system as well as the impacts that you could have, positive or negative, and the role that you play within the whole life cycle of mining. Learning from past mistakes, even ones that are happening at present, hopefully to create a different and a better future for the mining industry, as well as the rights holders and the stakeholders who were involved around those operations. And so again, although I'll be bringing a case study that has a negative outcome, potentially a positive outcome, depending on how we look at it, I don't want this to infer that all things mining are bad from this perspective, just that we're elevating the case studies to learn from lessons of the past. And also, I think to recognize that, as was mentioned at the very beginning, there's a lot more to mining today than just the technical aspects. There's an expectation now of mining companies and employees to know more than just their area of expertise, but how they fit within a system, again, of the life cycle itself. So Irma Yolanda is one of 11 women who successfully sued a Canadian mining company in civil law or civil courts in Ontario, in Canada, over the allegation of sexual violations on behalf of the company's security, as well as Guatemalan military and police. This is an emblematic case, a very violent one, that's connected with two others around the Phoenix mine, which is a nickel mine that was originally started by Inco in 1960. And we'll talk a little bit more about the case study a little bit further on in the presentation. But here marks Irma Yolanda. And this image itself actually ended up in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights as a part of the 150th anniversary of Canada back in 2015. You can see the photos from 2012. So I'd been going at that point for 2 years, visiting this community as a part of a research group that involved academics, documentary filmmakers and photographers, nonprofit organizations, as well as others in solidarity with the communities to amplify their voices. Quite often, because we may only hear what a company tells us in their press releases or what the government might amplify from the company in terms of good practices in mining. But when you get on the ground in a lot of places, you might hear a different story. Maybe it's a story from a small group of people, but still an impacted group of people. Or it could be a story of an entire community that's pushing back against a mining company for the lack of free and prior informed consultation. So as we move through these slides, I just want to ground ourselves, and starting off with Irma Yolanda, we'll hear a little bit more from her and other women throughout the presentation, but just as a starting point. I'd mentioned before, Matt had mentioned, I'm a professor in the Masters of Earth and Energy Resources Leadership. This is a part-time online master's program for working professionals in oil, gas, and mining. And so I teach a 12-week course on mining law, policy, and communities, covering both domestic and international laws, domestic from Canada, and use case studies as examples. So the Phoenix mine is one of the case studies that we use in this class, but through a module session. So they would get much more than what you're going to get a small snapshot of today. I wanted to mention, again, I'd mentioned UNBC, the small northern university that I did my master's at, but also in connection with Rights Action, one of the NGOs on the ground with whom I work, and is often the conduit or the introducer between myself and Indigenous communities, because they are there more constantly than I'm able to be from an academic setting. And then finally, in extending the work beyond what I do in the academy, I'm also the co-chair of the board of Mining Watch Canada, which is a 25-year-old nonprofit watchdog organization that is quite often an intervener in legal cases or works with Indigenous communities as they are resisting or countering mining that may be perceived by those communities as, again, being without consent. So there's a lot of work that's been covered in the last 15 years, but those are just some of the origins of how I got started doing this work. Although not a reading or an expectation for today, much of what I'm going to talk about is documented in the published book from 2021 called Testimonio: Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocide in Guatemala. These are contributed chapters from academics like myself, photojournalists, documentarians, legal scholars from Guatemala, as well as pieces from Indigenous activists, land rights defenders, and lawyers on the ground contributing to this work. And each one tells the story of up to 5 different mine sites that have happened across Guatemala, some of which are active today, others of which have mothballed that may be revitalized in the future. But we tell a story throughout this book around what it means to start a mining project in a landscape where violence has been at the forefront of community experiences for decades, if not centuries. So it does look at 5 centuries of conquest from other authors, but situates what's happening now in Guatemala as the outcomes of those centuries of violence. And so the question becomes for companies in the future that hope to do business in Guatemala, how will they move forward from a landscape where past mining companies or interactions between mining companies, communities, and the national government have been incredibly tense, if not devolved into violence? And so what we will have and what we will talk about here is really a wicked problem that you have within the industry of how to move forward if in the past things have been done inappropriately to gain trust of community members in the future. So I've been fortunate enough in the last 3 years to be doing yearly trips back to Guatemala to visit with communities that I've been working with for the last 15 years. And this is what I'll define as, again, solidarity accompaniment. So even though I'm not able to be there for a long period on the ground, I make multiple returns to the same communities to meet the same people year after year. This builds long-term relationships in research, as well as the ability for researchers like myself to document the experiences, people's interaction with place, space, and landscape over a long period of time. So I will also say that a lot of the research participants that I've had in the past have become long distance friends, right? Because we do so much work together over this long period of time. So as part of Irma Yolanda's struggle, one of 11 women who were sexually violated, one of whom stands here in the blue, I would say in the first quadrant. She is also next to Angelica Choc, who is a widow of a woman whose husband was killed by the leader of HUD-Bay security. And the young man sitting next to her in a wheelchair is Herman Schub, and he is another young person from that same community that was shot by a member of the company's private security and is now in a wheelchair as a result. Other examples across the country, and I'll show you a map in a few moments, come from Asonciamita, which is a small community outside of the El Escobal silver mine, hundreds of kilometers away from the Phoenix mine. And then others too, we've started more recently also talking to former mine workers, people that have worked in the mines, not just those who are in resistance, to talk about the conditions of their labor. And unfortunately, the diminished labor standards that happen internationally quite often and the health implications that are outcomes of those experiences for folks. In this particular home on the far right of Alfonso Diaz, this is a man who is now almost entirely deaf as a result of his job working at the time it was Glamis into Goldcorp mine for the Cerro Blanco mine on the eastern part of Guatemala, where when he was doing blasting, he was given very, very tiny earplugs, but over time has lost his hearing as a result of not having the proper health and safety equipment. So he now suffers as a result. He has no long-term support for income, and it's very difficult as a disabled person to seek employment in his small rural community. So these are some of the examples of the type of people that we would meet across the country to focus in on different mine sites to understand the experiences of those there, the similarities across multiple sites, or even the differences depending on those experiences. I'll move through this quickly just because I know it's not always the most interesting to folks, but all of the work that we do as social scientists is always grounded in methodological and theoretical frameworks. And so I identify in my research as a critical geographer who uses feminist and activist methodologies. What does that mean? They ask. Who is she? What it really means is that whenever I do work research, I'm always focused on power as a key term. Who has power in the situation? Who does not? Who can make the decisions around when a mine happens or if it happens at all? What are the tensions of power in a particular setting? Is that tension between Indigenous peoples and their government, or the federal government, as it were? Or is that tension between a community and the mining company, or the company and the government? There's any way that we can look at that. And then how does power shift or change over time, right? Are there methods of resistance that take back or apply power in different ways depending on how communities respond to these type of development projects? So I'm always curious about who has power or who does not, or how is power exercised within those spaces. One of the key pieces around power in these settings, and remember, I often will take a negative case study and kind of look at it through these lenses, is also around violence, understanding how does violence manifest and why does it happen? And we often think about violence as a direct source of violence, something catastrophic maybe that we see happen in the news, or direct violence that we see happen in front of ourselves. There are other forms of violence that are often invisible, but still undermine the outcomes of someone's life and their livelihoods. So, and things that are in this form of what is structural violence is a key lens that I use to really understand that this is not always the fault of someone who is poor, for example. It could be structures around an individual that has caused or perpetuates a form of poverty that they are existing with. I saw a hand and then it disappeared.
Oh, no, it's still up there.
Yeah,
But I wanted to ask you,
yes.
so to me, when someone used the word violence, I'm thinking of a physical act, but you're using the word violence in a way that is not.
Yeah.
Is that the best term? Because there is a real difference between being raped or simply being insulted.
Yep.
And I wonder what the thought process was in choosing the word violence.
Ooh, we'd have to go back to our violence theorizations of like all the way back to people like Johan Galtung, who were from the sociologists like the back in the 1970s that started to sketch out the different forms that one could experience violence in. And the most visible form is exactly what you've just mentioned, right? Something dramatic happening to an individual that we've decided is outside of the bounds of a social cultural norm,
A
right?
physical thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Not if it's not, to me, if it's not physical, it's not violence, but I understand that other people feel it differently. But I just wanted to make that point.
That's a fair point.
I don't have a background in violence theory.
Well, and
That's
fair.
for sure.
So I'll come forward to this slide and then maybe I'll go back for a quick moment because this particular slide was from my dissertation back from 2018 of how I pulled up Johan Galtung's, like from 1990. He had what he called a violence triangle. One of my contributions was to make it a square. Yes, that's what you do in academia. You make something a little bigger, wherein, to your exact point, direct violence in the top left-hand quadrant, right? Physical and psychological violence, threats, assaults, rape, murder. That is the direct form that you would probably see and recognize. Most people would recognize that this is a form of violence. But then you have different forms like environmental violence from different perspectives, different cultures might see the removal of a mountaintop as a violent environmental task, right? Or the rerouting of rivers could be the disruption of an ecosystem. So to others, this could be viewed as a form of violence. But the one that I'm very interested in my research often connects to what is known as structural violence. And if I go back one slide, these are all of the invisible ways in which perpetuate inequalities, poverty, racism, aspects of colonialism that are indirect, right? But could cause a direct violent outcome at the far end of things, or could just undermine someone's ability to make choices for a healthy livelihood. So this came from a paper that I can give you afterwards. I'm sorry, I have it in my notes, but not on the paper. And someone like Paul Farmer, who was a medical anthropologist, much of his work in Pathologies of Power, which is a very popular book that he wrote, looked at the experiences of people that were living with AIDS in Haiti. To understand that much of the suffering that existed for those folks in Haiti with this deadly disease that were going to carry for their lives ultimately were going to be shortened because there was no proper healthcare system within Haiti to be able to support the needs of people with HIV. There were no social services around those folks to then help families beyond to get themselves out of poverty. These are just some very small examples that undermined a person's health, or at least the continuation of a better health outcome, because the state of Haiti, which we know has unfortunately devolved, been very tumultuous, has even been called a failed state in recent years, was not able to provide the necessities that would help folks in those dire situations at least live better lives than what they did before. May I please see? Madison, your hand was up.
Hi, yeah, to me, this feels like it's sort of conflating the concept of harm with the concept of violence. Like you can be harmed without suffering violence. So I'm not sure, like maybe I missed how you're defining violence.
Well, harm can be a form of violence. It could be perceptual of like you're saying, right? An unintended harm versus a direct form of violence in itself. They're not interchangeable, but they do liken one another within the literature, that often harm goes with violence, but to varying degrees, depending on the action or the person's response to it. How would you define harm?
Well, I guess I'm saying, like, I think a lot of those things you're talking about, like the removal of a mountaintop, would harm someone, but I don't know if I would consider it violent, because at least my conception of violence is sort of like immediate, direct, and physical, if that makes sense.
That is it. So therein lies a great distinction, and I love this conversation that we're having, but let us move forward a little bit, wherein what I don't put on this is time. And you're absolutely right. Direct violence can happen in an immediate, very quickly, right? Cultural, structural, even environmental violence, those things can happen very slowly over time. So even if it was, slow leaching into a water source, right? It may have a harm, and it may not be perceived as violent today, but to a culture or to a different worldview, that harm could be perceived as violent if fish, or if rivers, or if other ecosystems actually have personhood or given personhood, like we've seen in a number of Latin American countries that now give the rights of human beings to waterways like rivers. So it is sometimes too about cultural worldviews and perspectives of what is harm versus what is violence. But this is great.
I guess could you give me an example of something that you would consider to be harm that's not violent then?
So a physical harm, a physical violence versus a harm. I think we would be getting into a little bit of the semantics at this point of like, is it more or less, right? So let's look for an example of some of the forms of structural violence that I have here on the page, and thinking about how these could be construed as forms of structural violence. And again, maybe we could rephrase them as structural harms if they're not in the immediate. But let's look at them from the perspective of like the domains of legal, economic, environmental, social, political, and health, right? So a mechanism of structural violence from these landscapes could be that revenue flows to a state and shareholders, but not to the affected communities. Local economies become dependent and unstable. So if we're not creating like a structure where communities are able to be independent, not reliant 100% on a resource operation that's happening in the community, and that they are linked to, say, the volatility of that operation staying open or closing, depending on the markets. One example that the outcome of this is that royalties rarely compensate lost land or livelihoods. So do the royalties trickle down, or do they get given directly to a community compared to actually being sent only to the federal government and then trickling down through social services and spendings? I saw Robert.
Under this, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just under this definition, would something like insider trading or what Bernie Madoff did be considered violent because you're stealing? But I guess in my head, I make a distinction still between like stealing and the harm associated with it and actual violence. I think I'm just unclear on how you're defining violence.
Okay. I'm taking a wide perspective of violence where harm could be umbrellaed underneath that. Right. And I think you're absolutely right, actually, for structural violence. So how is it possible that someone could trade in a way that, like insider trading, like you're saying, then benefits one, where's the power sit, versus how did many not benefit from that insider trading? So just for a moment, I saw Robert had his hand up, and then I wanted to show a couple of other examples. Robert?
Yes. So I do like the word harm, because when you say violence, there's no possibility of a benefit. But when you say the word harm, it's like, well, wait a minute. There's environmental degradation, but people are able to support their families better with jobs. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to have a mixture of harms and benefits? Because nothing is any development, and any kind of a mine is a development. Any development is at one level going to be harmful, at another level is going to be beneficial because of the job opportunities. And many students are very interested in job opportunities, you may have noticed.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a fabulous point to raise on this too, is that it's, in my next slide, I promise you, is a wicked problem. There is no solution, in that there will be benefits for some folks, right? Who will receive benefits either from jobs being employed, investors who receive returns, CEOs who build one, strong operation that then can spin off and build more, right? Compared to others who might see a mine in their community as a form of violence, right? Who are against mining no matter what, because it's a difference of their worldview of how the earth should be treated, and or how they have decided collectively how to steward or guardian those lands differently, right? So I will say, and this is part of, I think, my intro, but maybe not as well done, of like, there's going to be all sides of this when you're looking at an operation. And I can't think of one that I've seen yet around the world where there's 100% benefit, no one's been harmed and or left out. But these are the balances that we have to think about moving forward, now that we know a lot more about the communities that we're mining around than we did in the past. I think that's great. Folks, you're fantastic in that you're diving deep even into the terms, the definitions you're trying to understand, and I really appreciate that. So let's, if I can, maybe give one more example from this particular structural violence piece. And Mackenzie, if I still haven't satisfied those pieces at the end, let me at least find some definitions of harm versus violence that might clarify it for us afterwards. But I appreciate that. I've never been asked that question before. I think it's really good. It's somebody else's hand up. Clinton. Harm is also more useful in court, provided there's a functioning judicial system there. It's good to be able to have a broad term like harm, which covers all of it. Yes, unless you're actually talking about direct violence, right? And then in those kind of court cases, they want to hear more than just harm. But I think that's a good point that you raise. All right. So as we were looking at it here, let's just take, for example, because I drew on Paul Farmer before and talk about health, right, as a mechanism of structural violence, chronic exposure to toxins, stress, displacement, loss of food security as a result. If you're already in a dry corridor and you don't have access to water and a mining company uses more of the local reservoirs of water that are there, what happens to you in terms of your food security if you're living a subsistence livelihood? So for some, it might be in this health example of increased respiratory or reproductive health issues near the mine sites that could have detrimental impacts to those living adjacent to those forms of development. So see, as I promised, we have a wicked problem, folks. And it's not just that. People have different perceptions and views around the benefits of mining, the needs for mining today. But I think you folks also have something really difficult to consider as two sides of the coin. Right now, what I've noticed, and this is a news article from the 4th of November, just this week, and I say forgive me, it's not news, it's actually from Nature. So this is a bit of a summary from a published journal article about climate change is devastating mining of minerals, the minerals that you need to fight it. And so climate change is making mining much, much harder, a much more riskier venture, right? Because of the impacts of climate change. I loved this paper because of this fantastic graph that they have, too hot to mine. All of the places around the world, or at least some of the critical minerals that are listed there, and the extended number of days that it took because it was too hot to operate. One of the mines in Guatemala, the Cerro Blanco mine, is in a geothermal zone. And so much of the reason that mine actually hasn't been developed is because once you go into the tunnel type construction that they need, it becomes much too hot to send people underground. And so that's a below ground problem compared to the above ground one that this particular article is chasing. But it is absolutely something that is having a detrimental impact, causing a lot more expenditures, finances, things like that, because of the exacerbation of climate change in much of the areas of the world. But then you also have the other problem, or the other wicked side of the coin, right? Where not only is climate change making it harder for industry to grow or to do their business, but it's also a challenge because of public and community perceptions of the work that's being done as well, linked to climate change. So this particular report that came out just last year highlighted a piece of research that had said, mining had contributed in the past of a global footprint of, I think it says around 4 to 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So there are areas of the industry that have been identified as maybe more polluters in the past than now the green mining efforts that are happening moving forward. But again, this points back to people's understandings, perceptions, and experiences that you may have to overcome as folks that are working in this industry because of past practices. Again, as a Canadian, and maybe this is just a bit of an intel for the Americans that are on the call too, and others, but Canada has moved towards, in the last 2 years, having a critical minerals strategy. And their request within this strategy is that these supplies be responsibly sourced, not only domestically in Canada, but also from around the world. And I'm seeing your other point there, Clinton, and also added challenge for mine ventilation, all of the things that climate change causes, right? But then again, within the Canadian Critical Mineral Strategy, Canada is seeking to build a resilient global supply chain for critical minerals that's resilient for climate change, resilient from political strife and turmoil that's happening around the world right now. And they are aligning it with global economic, social, and governance standards. We can talk about the evolution from corporate social responsibility now to environmental social governance. But the shift, what I've noticed in ESG, is that it is really a risk-adverse framework compared to the social sustainability that I want to elevate to you today. Canadian mining assets around the world, for those of you that have looked at these maps from Canada before, this comes from Natural Resources Canada from 2 years ago. It is their most updated map. Maybe they'll come up with another one by February of next year. But you'll notice in this map that Latin America, hands down, continues to receive the most Canadian mining assets globally. That's Latin America, Central America. I'm even going to combine Mexico into that a little bit, even though it fits more into maybe a North American viewpoint. As a geographer, we love our maps and we love our regions. So it's very easy to swap whether one's into a Latin American context or into a North American context. But even more so have we been investing in this region of the world than, say, Africa, Oceania, and even Asia combined. So Latin America is the hot spot for Canadian mining company activity. I'm sure it's also the similar, probably for American companies, Chinese companies, Russia companies as well around the world, getting into these regions for the critical minerals that they host. And similar to your comment before, Robert, about the harms versus the benefits. The Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, also highlight where mining plays a role in alleviating poverty and creating a better world for people. But there's always a negative to that as well, where mining has advanced a lot of things like technologies for medical care, from the minerals that are produced, supporting the green transition. Like we've said before, there may also be drawbacks to those activities as well. And so there needs to be the balance found for today's world. We've talked a lot in Canada about electric vehicles, and I will say for any of you that are here, maybe there's a similarity in the States, but for quite a while, our government was telling us that the future was electric and that we have to be buying electric vehicles. We have to be supporting the critical minerals rush, or the critical minerals rush supporting us to get our new electric vehicles. But already in Canada, we've seen a dip both in automakers making these electric vehicles domestically for us, as well as what those batteries can handle in a Canadian cold climate. I'm sure the batteries will run better with our folks in Texas over the wintertime than maybe they will in the parts of Canada here where we're at. But this is some of the things that the rhetoric, what is the average person hearing, right? Because that forms a lot of people's opinions around how do we get these minerals? Or maybe they don't ask the questions, okay, I got my electric vehicle, but where did all these minerals and metals come from at the end of the day? Again, as a critical light for Canada, from my perspective, Canada has a long northern shadow. And what I will say too, in the 15 years that I've been working in Central America, it started off with my colleagues that were from the US trying to put Canadian flags on their backpacks. But over the years, we've really experienced that Canadians are often not welcome in a lot of these communities because they are seen as being aligned with or potentially employed by the Canadian mining companies that they have been resisting. And so Canada doesn't hold the good neighborly national view that we have of ourselves isn't necessarily what other people view us as. And I think that's hard for a lot of Canadians to both imagine as well as maybe live with, because it is quite ingrained within us at a very early age that Canadians are helpful, that we've supported our neighbors to the south, that we've participated as allies in war that have been won, but not necessarily to look at ourselves in a negative way or a negative light as to how we may not have been the best players around the world. So at a time, and this is a few years ago, pushing on 20 actually, 75% of the mining companies in the world were headquartered in Canada. Now that number has dropped to closer to 50 to 60, but Canada still remains a juggernaut of mining company operations, mostly domiciled in Toronto or in Vancouver near our stock exchanges. There's operations in over 120 countries worldwide, 8,000 exploration and exploitation projects. Canada is known for having a legal haven for the protection of companies. And so one of the rationales and the reasons that folks end up having the companies domiciled in Canada is a lot of the legal mechanisms support mining companies. It's also not a lot of the pieces are voluntary in terms of what goes on in environmental social governance. There is a lot that is heavily regulated too, and this is something that I will say that I hear about from a lot of students, that Canadian markets are some of the most regulated in the world compared to other jurisdictions. But critics, Mining Watch or others, would still say that these are voluntary. They are not enforced in terms of the type of goodwill that they will give to communities. ESG has given a rise in reporting. However, the reporting is limited to the narrow fields that are within those frameworks. And there's lots of cases around Canadian foreign policy, Canadian embassies showing support to companies abroad over that of the citizens themselves. Go ahead, Robert. What are your thoughts?
What do you mean by reporting?
So, reporting of rights violations or what goes on if things go wrong.
I see. Thank you.
Because I would say the opposite to when we're talking about regulation, you folks have a lot of reporting to do, especially around environmental impacts and what you need to produce in terms of the policies around meeting the expectations of the laws. So the limited reporting is essentially if something goes wrong off the rails from a human rights response. Okay. Again, old in the sense of the names have changed, but very much still is the same, where Canada and Canadian mining companies receive, again, whether it's that legal support, if not federal support from different offices and different agencies, and even further than that, international banking institutions to, again, help to facilitate mining happening on the ground that, is really available to this level of industry and maybe not others. So I won't worry about so much of that. One other piece, and then I'm going to move into the next section of this, is that the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, when they did a research report on their own members to understand, what are the violations or the perceptions of Canadian mining companies operating abroad, their own research brought back that the mining themselves or the companies themselves were involved in an increasing number of occupational, unlawful, unethical human rights violations or environmental violations. And this is back again in like the 2008, 2009 range. But at the time, too, the ownership of companies involved in those kind of conflicts were predominantly Canadian over those of US, Australian, or other large nations that are heavy into mining themselves. I highly recommend this book. Robert, come on back on. You're so polite with your hand.
That slide before,
yeah, go back.
I was looking at the ownership of companies involved in mining conflicts, 1999, 2009. Those numbers look fairly small compared to Canada. So you're saying that in East Africa, only 4% of the companies that are operating get a complaint? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that so they would have been Indonesian-owned companies, or they would have been UK-owned companies, not necessarily.
Oh, I see. I see. Thank you. Now
yeah, no, it's a great distinction. Thank you for that. Highly recommend this book, written by journalist Christopher Paulin. Oh, John, sorry. Go ahead.
Wasn't 33% pretty good when you went back and said that 75% of the companies were based out of Canada? Sounds like that's less than half of them are more likely to have a violation as percentages.
Or it could be that there's a few that are really bad actors and have a lot, right? The numbers aren't quite spliced the way to be able to see for sure.
Yeah, and it sounds like to me Canada's probably a pretty good operator.
And they're seen that way by many for sure. I've heard from the embassy officials of like, at least it's Canada and not X country, right? But still a reputational damage, I would say, to be the most in violation. And even if it is correlated with having the most companies themselves.
It is funny that the US companies are 5 times better in these areas than the Canadian companies. That kind of surprises me.
Great questions and comments. Thank you. Okay, so this particular book spans what Christopher Paulin talks about from an ecological perspective called sacrifice zones. So what he says, and I think this does, maybe it goes back to our conversation about harm and violence, but the argument that Christopher Pollan makes is that as the demand for minerals becomes greater internationally, and we know that these resources deplete over time as we mine them, we will race to the farthest corners of the earth, if not now, into outer space or to the lowest parts of the seabed to be able to get the minerals that we need for whether it's a green revolution, the sustainment of humanity, however we want to look at it. He makes the case in his book that there is a shift towards these green energy structures, but without clear pathways of how sustainable change will be achieved, or questions asked about who will be impacted by this change. And so he really promotes a systems thinking approach of like all of the people that are involved from a rights holder, stakeholders positioning on this. And he asked the question, like, whose development is this at the end of the day? Is this for the development of the corporation, the company, the domiciled country, and or is it to the benefit of the communities in which it is intended to serve? So as I'd mentioned before, from the map of our investments of assets from Canada, it points us towards Latin America and colonial legacies of extraction, right? And this is an area that has had a lot of attention from academics, both from historical patterns of extraction, mining that was done from the Inca and the Maya and the Aztecs themselves, right? This is not new to them. They very much had this in their past, but the ways in which mining have operated since then have really have changed the landscape since those times, right? And so I'm just mindful of my time here. I just want to move into a few more of the slides where we talk a bit more about the case themselves. But I wanted to highlight too, like this is a topic that has been discussed a lot from Latin American academics and scholars themselves. One of the pieces by Eduardo Galeano, which is called Open Veins of Latin America, talks about 500 years of conquest in that Latin America itself has always been an open vein for extraction. But again, to whose benefit is always the question. So if we go back to the book Testimonio and highlighting here Guatemala, if anyone has ever been to Guatemala or plans on going, I highly encourage it, despite even some of the pieces that I'll talk about today. Just be mindful of it if you ever go. All right, so key things to know about the country, I think from a historical perspective, we won't do 500 years, but we might do the last 60 or so, is that Guatemala developed their first mining law in 1960. And the royalties from that particular law were at 6%. So 6% of what was made out of the mine would stay within the country. When they rewrote the mining law in 1997, 1 year after a peace accord was signed after a 36-year internal armed conflict, they dropped the royalty rate to 1%. So now only 1% of the revenue from the mine itself stays in the country. Half of that percent stays with the federal government. The other half goes down to the municipality itself. John, what's your question?
I contend that number. You're talking about royalty staying in the country. They pay income taxes too, and that stays in the country, and a lot of it.
Yeah, there are very low taxes on these companies.
Plus, they hire a lot of people. A lot of that money stays in the country too. So,
yeah, the hiring that gets done today is quite a bit. It's interesting, right? Maybe this is a sustainability conversation for another class. The argument in the past has been that these create jobs, but I think the argument of the future is that these low-paying jobs that are basically trainable for people on the ground that won't have university degrees, that won't have higher education to do the technical work, will start to go away with the rise of AI and automation. And so a lot fewer of the indigenous communities around these mines are going to benefit from jobs in the future as companies move away from the training of those low-skilled workers to automate them into machines. So it's the companies in the past, a lot of the community people that were hired, yes, they would be doing low-skilled jobs. These companies have also hired in technical experts from other areas around the world to do the mine work because people on the ground won't have the education and the expertise needed to develop those mines.
I contend though. I mean, they hire a lot of services. They got a lot of things. I look at a lot of mining income statements. Until the last 6 months, these companies aren't making any money. So very little of that money is flowing out of the country. Most of that money is staying in the country until recently. So
So you're also talking about then like the side
investors aren't making any money, that's for sure. No one wants to
There you
own
go.
these stocks. So
For sure. So I think it's an important point that you're raising here that there are, I won't call them side businesses, but that like the peripheral businesses that end up happening around the rise of a mining company in an area, whether that's like stores, conveniences, services, both related and unrelated, but the rise of populations that might be drawn in for the work that needs to be done, right? All right. So just mindful that within this context of the royalty shift and the drop, and the multiple, there are 5 mine sites that we study within the book, but we're going to just look at the Phoenix mine site for the next few moments. Again, from a perspective of a landscape of violence, I'd said a moment ago that, context matters in terms of where you're going to open up a mine or the mine that you're operating within if you're just being hired and it's already there. But I think it matters to do your research as a company, as a staff member anyways, just to know where you're going and what the experience is. We talk again, because it's a landscape of violence perspective, about the 36-year internal armed conflict and the damage done to an entire country and the post-peace process that exists. So even though the war ended and was officially signed off with a peace accord in 1996, 40 years later almost, folks are still looking for loved ones that were killed during the genocide. There has been a historical truth commission to look at the crimes perpetrated during that 36 years. And you have whole groups of folks like Alexandra Pedersen in the center in the image here who are still looking for, say, their father that was disappeared overnight at the height of the internal armed conflict itself. What do you think, Robert?
Well, just to be clear, the Civil War, the genocide that happened in so many places in Latin America during the 80s, that wasn't directly linked to mining. That was there were certainly contributing factors. So it's a little bit confusing adding this. Clearly, that was an ugly episode in the history of those countries, but
so let's look at a layer that exists when you come in as a company, that this is an experience that people have had on the ground and that you are then layering yourself in the context on top of it. It's not caused by mining. We'll show you in another slide in a second where it's involved mining because in that armed conflict. But to make the point that mining doesn't happen in a vacuum. I say this to the physicists that I work with, and technically physics does happen in a vacuum, but for this particular piece, we can't imagine that mining happens without all of this other context around it. So that's the point that I'm trying to make, albeit maybe confusing. So thank you for pointing that out. It's also in the space of where it's known as Guatemala is within what's known as the violence triangle. And so areas of Latin America where high homicide rates exist are often, as Robert had mentioned before, linked with areas that have experienced civil armed conflicts or dire experiences of war and genocide. And so again, this is a layer of violence that is underneath what you are operating on within a company. But it does have a connection today with the violence that's experienced on the ground, with rights organizations, NGOs, making the connection of rights defenders who are killed. And quite often what we find in the case here in Guatemala of the remarkable rise of murders of rights defenders, these could be environmental rights defenders, human rights defenders, indigenous rights defenders, wherein we're seeing an increasing number of people that are killed, not directly by the mining companies themselves. They could be murdered by someone who is a part of the community that wants the mine to happen. And it's a clandestine group that takes another individual out who they see as being problematic or could stop a mine from happening. And so while these are not direct actions of companies by any means, they are the pieces around it of the tensions that exist on the ground and the unfortunate outcomes that can happen if we're not mindful of what the histories are like in those communities or how mining is perceived by them. Climate change and drought. We're seeing a huge increase of folks who are fleeing their homes. You've probably heard of In the past, they were called caravans, mass migrations that were happening with people marching from areas of Latin America all the way to the United States. We're now seeing a period of time for the first one in history where people are doing a U-turn and are not going to the US anymore. They're trying to migrate into other countries in Latin America instead. But quite often it is because of climate change exacerbations that have made food insecurity a high risk for folks. Guatemala has the highest child malnutrition rate in all of Latin America. It has one of the highest rates of malnutrition for women as well. And so as we see these kind of experiences, mining could be something positive for people to raise them out of poverty. Like our colleagues here have said, it provides jobs. But who does it to provide jobs for? Who could be elevated out of poverty? And what happens to the many, many, many folks that won't receive jobs, but also will still be living in the same communities? These are 3 images. The far left one that's more lush is from my trip in November of 2022 at the end of the rainy season in Guatemala. The center and the right image are from May of 2024 and 2025 of the exact same region, but at the beginning, or sorry, the end of the dry season. Look at the difference. They get high rains now, more torrential rains than they would get, or they get drought in those 2 seasons that they get. Sometimes it's shifting too, where the rains don't come for 6-7 weeks into what is known as the rainy season. And that extends food insecurity as well, when traditional practices can't be implemented for farmers themselves. Clinton, good for you. Are these Quechua Maya? So the Maya that we're talking about today are actually not Quechua, or sorry, Quiche, they're Quechua. So one of the two, right? So Quiche mine, they're actually more in the center of the country, and the Quiche Maya are all off to the right, where we're going to be talking about at the Phoenix mine. So again, in my last few moments here of a Phoenix mine example, and apologies, I feel like I'm running out of time from the good questions. This particular mine started with Inco. That was a Manitoba-based company at the time in 1960 because nickel prices were going up. The company was able to get in at a good time in support from the government. But unfortunately, the Quechua Maya, who have been defending their land rights at the time, were they were cited, I would say the company itself was cited within the Historic Truth Commission of actually having supplied company trucks to the military during the internal armed conflict. And so there is overlap during the conflict itself with the company. And that's a historic piece that's captured within that document. But it's something that the community members remember. So those company trucks themselves, again, were cited as being part of the 1978 massacre in Panzos, which most of the survivors, or sorry, the children of survivors are people that we interview. And so their historic experience with the company was that they sided with the military during the armed conflict. And so that sets up and perpetuates that experience with them for any mining company coming in the future, even if their intentions are better. So just as a link of like things in the past that can have a detrimental impact on how people perceive mining in the future. Even if it didn't happen to them, it may have happened to their parents. The mine itself ends up mothballing in 1982 when nickel prices take a dive. But it continues to have issues of rights violations, indigenous rights violations over the course of many years. And so the case that I spoke at the very beginning of 11 women who were sexually assaulted in 2007 was coupled with 2 other stories of the murder of an indigenous leader, the husband of Angelica Choc, and the shooting of a young man named Herman Chub. So these are 3 cases that ended up coming forward towards Hudbay Minerals, who assumed liability from a purchase from Sky Resources. This is the other thing too. It might not have happened on a company's watch. They may have assumed liability in the purchase of another mining company. So that's something to think about too, from an earlier question about 33%. In terms of the violations, I couldn't tell you whether or not those were direct from the companies or assumed with the liability of purchases and mergers. So that's just a little footnote. But while the court cases are going on, so all 3 of these cases end up being filed in Canada in civil courts. So no one will go to jail as a result. These are not criminal trials. They were civil ones that would have a financial outcome. And it was determined that they would be heard in Canada because the legal team for the Indigenous plaintiffs made the case that Guatemala is such a violent place with a failing judicial system that only 2% of murder allegations and convictions actually happen. 98% of murders go unaccounted for or without accountability within the systems themselves. So a big part of this was around free and prior informed consent, right? The ability for Indigenous peoples to make an informed choice about how territories and lands that are within their guardianship are used. And this also complicates things too as to whether or not a government has signed on to the international agreement around ILO 169, International Labor Organization's Convention 169 on the rights of free and prior informed consent, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which also outline those pieces. One of the tensions that I have noticed in conversations about FPIC as to whether or not it constitutes a veto. So is it a definitive no? That communities can say, no, mining may not happen here, and that ends the conversation? Or is it the first step of a starting point of a conversation? That is still a debated topic, I think, in many circles. But as a result of earlier mines opening up after the peace accords had ended, you saw a wave of resistance in Guatemala of entire communities holding what they called consultas de buena fe, or consultations in good faith, that were organized by Indigenous governments. The Quechua, or the Quiche was one of them, for an earlier colleague that mentioned that in the chat. Where entire communities would vote, and they would include children from the age of 7 and up that were eligible from Indigenous laws to make informed decisions. But communities over 100 across the country have now voted yes or no to mining in their immediate jurisdictions, most often of which result in a 98% or higher vote in saying no to mining within this space. So hard then, if you wanted to be a mining company to come into this area in the future, if you see a landscape that has voted no to mining in the past, what would change their mind in the future? So these cases that came forward in Canada have actually just ended after almost 15 years, I would say, sitting in civil courts, even though they've had a few instances now where there's been some precedents set as a result of these cases. And my last slide here, just as I'm wrapping up, I just wanted to bring in the voice of Rosa Elvira. She was the lead plaintiff of the 11 women, a colleague of Irma Yolanda's, who you saw at the very beginning, just to amplify some of the pieces that she was saying about how painful the process had been for her over 15 years. Not even that, there was going to be reparations made as the outcomes of a settlement with this lawsuit, but just that there are also new companies coming in now that seem to be unaware of, or maybe in her perspective, uncaring of the fact that these harms have happened. And there, I use the word harm instead of violence, right? So she says it's very painful that coming in are the new companies. There will be more pain caused in all of our families, not like it will happen in any other way. It has always been going on in cycles of the past, as it is the only way, and that's all that awaits us. To her, the companies lie all along, saying that they're bringing development. All we have is more poverty, more destruction of Mother Earth, all of our natural resources. For decades of this, we say no more mining. We haven't achieved it, but that's what we say. But the cycles repeat. I'm so sad that even our civil case, we're not the only ones that have suffered. But there is just no response to the demands and to the lawsuits in Canada. So she said this a year before the closing out of those settlements. But what I wanted to highlight from this piece is what Rosa Elvira is saying in the terms of repetition, right? From what I'd shared earlier around the Panzos massacre, to her experience of violence with a Canadian company, to what she's expecting in the future, right? Those cycles of violence, those experiences will stay with her. and they will be shared across her communities. And I will also say too, with the rise of social media in the last 20 years, these communities talk in and amongst one another now more so than they were able to before. So when Consultas de Buena Fe were happening, they were using Facebook, Twitter at the time, everything to share results and inspire other communities to take action in resistance. So these kinds of I guess the social license to operate isn't always attainable in some of these locales because of past practices. So the question then becomes, how do we approach social sustainability in the future? I know I'm running out of time, or I've passed that, so I just wanted to leave it with some lessons here around the critical minerals. I pointed to a document that was made by Mining Watch Canada. It's like I said, it was a not-for-profit in Canada that looks critically at mining company actions, both domestically and abroad. And this particular report that they put out were some highlights to be considering in the future around sustainability and social sustainability in mining. So one of the things for them was that critical minerals is rapidly being framed as climate and energy transition imperatives, but that the human rights and environmental safeguards are not keeping up. So what does that mean on the ground for people or for you as practitioners in the field? Rights holders, especially Indigenous peoples and local communities, remain treated as stakeholders or risks rather than as rights holders with agency and territory. Right? So that's the difference between CSR and ESG frameworks versus what organizations like Mining Watch and communities are pushing forward to have more rights holders, community members have agency in the conversations. And then the last 2 points, life cycle mining, or the life cycle of mining from claim staking to extraction to recycling, involves multiple human rights risks. So focusing only on extraction misses the full steps. And I think you've made some good points too of the full systems that we should be thinking about through all of mining. And then finally, environmental and climate imperatives are being used to legitimize faster and more expansive mining. But this may deepen the structural violence and ecological harm. There's that harm again. Compared to if we were to ask the question, how many mines, which mines, how do we, obtain the critical minerals that we need without necessarily over mining as a result? So I will end it there, 10 minutes over, and I'm sorry, Matt, but thank you, and open up for any more questions and conversations. But I really do appreciate the questions that I've heard and the comments so far. It keeps me thinking, and it's a good challenge. And I respect too that like a lot of the things that I brought here today have been maybe different ideas or different concepts than maybe what you've thought about. So thank you very much for your patience and your thinking through those topics with me today.